energy systems. Now, not often spoken about, and often neglected aspect of training and everything. Now, an understanding of energy systems that the body utilizes during physical exercise will give you the great insight into how to get the most from your training, how to be much better prepared for training, and how to make your body much more efficient in recovering from training. If you're natural, recovery is really important because you're not injecting anything to quicken the process. Training directed at training energy systems instead of focusing on mass gain will significantly increase your performance. Now, when it comes to superior all-round performance, mass gain dudes always come last, lugging all that unnecessary weight around with them. And much more importantly, this will keep you functioning with the movement patterns of youth, and not ending up all stiff and restricted like a typical bodybuilder. This is all-round performance involving strength training, resistance training, high intensity interval training, sprinting, distance running, endurance work, everything. If you are training sets of 10 reps all the time, you will never have optimum performance, an optimum body, or optimum hormones. It will always be beyond you. When muscles contract or exert force in any way, the energy used to power the muscles is a molecule called ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. Now, how efficient our muscle cells are at producing ATP determines our level of stamina and how long we can keep going during explosive movements before becoming tired. Now, muscles can only store a small amount of ATP, which is enough for a few seconds of activity. So the muscles must be able to continually make ATP to keep working. Now there are three main energy pathways your body uses to supply your muscles with ATP to keep your muscles going. The creatine phosphate system, or it's better known as ATP-CP, the lactate system, which is also known as anaerobic glycolysis, and the aerobic system. Now, the creatine phosphate system uses creatine phosphate for fuel. Anaerobic glycolysis uses glycogen, the body's form of stored glucose, and the aerobic system breaks down the glucose from carbohydrates, fatty acids, and amino acids from protein using oxygen. Now, how this works is that, when you begin any form of exertion, the muscles will use up the stored ATP, and this typically only lasts for anything between 2 to 6 seconds, depending on how efficient you are and how well you've eaten for these energy systems as well. Now, to make more ATP as quickly as possible, the muscles then turn to creatine phosphate. This system will provide energy to last for roughly 20 to 30 seconds. Again, this depends on how efficient you are. However, this source of energy is quickly depleted, and the intensity of your activity will determine how quickly it's depleted. As your muscles continue using creatine phosphate, then anaerobic glycolysis then takes over as the primary energy system using stored glycogen, and this system produces enough ATP to typically last up to about 2 minutes, more or less. The byproduct of glycolysis is lactic acid, and when acidity increases in muscle cells, then muscle power and performance declines. Those who say that your body doesn't need carbs, it does need carbs if you want to feed this energy system. The aerobic energy system produces the most ATP for longer, but it's a slower process, so this system takes much longer to become the primary energy pathway. The difference between this system and the previous two that I've mentioned is that this system requires oxygen and the two anaerobic systems do not. The aerobic system is associated with, basically stamina levels and endurance capabilities. As long as oxygen is present and there is fuel available from stores of fat, carbohydrates and protein, the aerobic system can continue to make ATP, for many hours in the case of some people. Continued production is dependent on the replenishment of these fuels. This is the purpose of food and nutrition, is to provide the body with energy to make ATP. Now, so depending on the activity, this will determine which energy system becomes the predominant energy system being used during that activity. The body uses all the fuel sources in varying proportions. This depends on exercise intensity, the amount of fuel available, and the speed at which the energy is required. Now, the creatine phosphate system is the fastest acting system, and it's fueled by creatine. Now, animal proteins such as red meat, seafood, dairy, and of course you can supplement with creatine, and this is why creatine supplements are used in conjunction with weight training and short burst interval type training, because intermittent short bursts of explosive activities cause the ATP-CP energy system to dominate. But to increase your levels of creatine naturally, you should also consider amino acids, because neglect this and you might as well not bother using a creatine supplement. Natural creatine is synthesized in the body from the amino acids methionine, glycine and arginine. Now, to optimize ATP-CP pathway, supplementing these three aminos will boost natural creatine production. You'll get more from that than from any creatine supplement, in fact. Now, glucose is the muscle's next fastest source of ATP, and glycogen is the stored form of glucose. Carbohydrate is the most readily available fuel source for the body. Carbs are broken down into glucose and stored in the muscles as glycogen. It's predominantly used in exercise of moderate to high intensity and is easily and very quickly broken down to make ATP. Moderately intense exercise will typically deplete glycogen stores completely in around 1 hour and 30 minutes. Again, this is all down to how well you've trained, eaten for these energy systems. When glycogen stores are low, performance is drastically reduced and only a low level of intensity can be maintained. This is because fat cannot be burned efficiently when glycogen levels are low. Adequate levels of carbohydrates are necessary for the efficient combustion of fats. Those who include carbohydrates in their diet can go on a lot longer and have a much more stamina and endurance than people on low carbs or no carb diets. Now, fat is stored in the body as triglycerides. Now, this stored fat is broken down and metabolized as fatty acids. Fat is mainly used as a primary fuel source when exercise is of a moderate to low intensity, typically during endurance training. But even at exercise in intermittent form at higher intensities, the same process occurs as you progress further in time into your session. Protein is only ever used by the body as a last resort, as a primary energy source. Now, typically this takes place when glycogen stores are depleted. Protein can be broken down to be used as a primary fuel source if necessary. This usually only occurs during extreme endurance events and during prolonged activity, or in cases where glycogen or fat stores are depleted due to malnutrition or starvation, for example, during fasting or prolonged periods of caloric deficit. Now, this triggers a process called gluconeogenesis, where the body converts protein and amino acids into glucose to be used by the body as energy. This primarily uses amino acids from muscle tissues to produce glucose when carbohydrate intake is low, or when glycogen is depleted. These doctors online who are telling people not to eat carbs are, fucking your performance, really. Most of them are injecting supplements, to counter this. Now, the body can also utilize ketones for energy. Now onto the subject of these cranky doctors that are online. This especially so when the body is placed into a state of ketosis. Ketones are an acidic byproduct of fatty acid metabolism produced in the liver when glucose is not available. Ketones are an element of normal metabolism and are regulated by the hormones insulin and glucagon. Now, the problem with ketones arises when starvation, Prolonged caloric deficit, illness, infection, or a disease like diabetes forces the liver to metabolize higher amounts of fatty acids. High blood levels of ketones can cause metabolic acidosis and put stress on the kidneys. If ketones remained elevated for too long, it can lead to a condition called ketoacidosis, which can lead to many bodily complications. Ketones become an energy source during extreme circumstances. For example, a diet low in carbohydrates, low calorie diet, prolonged caloric deficit, or during an extreme physical endurance event like these 100-mile runs that these people do. When ketone levels are high during physical exercise, they can easily be transported from the blood to the muscles to enter the Krebs cycle to produce ATP. The fuel for ketones is amino acids. Now, this is the basis for these cranky doctors who tell you that your body doesn't need carbs, but you're placing yourself into a situation of, excess bodily stress for no reason. Now, that covers the basics of the energy systems themselves. I'll be following this up with a video on training these energy systems. Subscribe and follow for more.